Okay, so one of the co-sponsors of the series, Sister Carol D'Angelo from the Sisters of Charity of New York, will begin with giving a general welcome. So unmute yourself, Carol, and take it away.
Okay, well, I am glad to welcome all of us to the second of our 7 monthly webinars that are co-sponsored by the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth, Sisters of Charity of New York, and religious organizations along the river, commonly referred to as ROAR. So this series, A Journey to Integral Ecology, the 7 goals of the Laudato Si Action Platform, offers us an opportunity each month to learn how a different Laudato Si goal is being practiced. It is also an opportunity for us to explore together our call towards integral ecology and ecological conversion. Each month, as we focus on a different Laudato Si goal, we hope to grow in our awareness and response to Pope Francis's call to see everything as interconnected and to act out of that interconnectedness. Each Laudato Si goal, with its different focus, is a call to celebrate and care for God's creation, to live simply and sustainably, and to collaborate with others in working for personal and communal conversion and transformation to ensure a flourishing earth community. And isn't this what all of us on this call want to leave as a gift and legacy to our children, our grandchildren, and future generations? This specific webinar today focuses on the second Laudato Si goal, response to the cry of the poor. So after the opening prayer, Father Terence Moran will introduce Dan Cosacchi. But now I'd like to invite Sister Alice Marie Giordano, a member of the Ursulines of the Roman Union and also a member of ROAR, to lead us in the opening prayer. Thank you, Elry.
Good evening. This prayer is taken from a prayer written by Art Laffin, a member of the Washington Catholic Worker, and he wrote it while he was sitting in the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. So let's place ourselves there, where Francis first built that small church. Francis, our brother, as we pray on your feast, we remember the small church you and your friends built by hand, stone by stone. Help us and all followers of Jesus to build a church today that has as its foundation the gospel mandate of unconditional love, mercy, compassion, justice, peace, and reconciliation. Help us to create a church of true communion, recognizing that each person is a special member of the body of Christ, a church that embraces each person as equal in God's eyes, a church that acknowledges its sins and seeks forgiveness for any harm done to others, a church that denounces racism, sexism, and all forms of discrimination, a church of servant leaders. Help us to make the church truly be a peace church, a church that renounces all injustice, violence, killing, weapons, and war, and always advocates for the poor and the victims. As you loved peace and creation, help all people to protect and safeguard all life and our sacred earth and environment. Help all people who comprise the church to always stand for love, life, and creation. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Elry. So we have 52 screens, and some of you are more than one person on the screen, and I see people from both coasts and in between. So it's wonderful to join people from all across the country. And it's a nice coincidence that we're doing this second Laudato Si Action Platform goal, a response to the cry of the poor, on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the saint who was the great inspiration for the pontificate of Pope Francis and whose canticle gives the title to his landmark encyclical, Laudato Si. Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. So I can't think of a better person to help us plumb the depths of what Pope Francis is saying than Dr. Daniel Cosacchi. Dan is a native of Connecticut and has attended an array of Jesuit institutions, Fairfield Prep, Fordham, Boston College, and finally Loyola University in Chicago, where he received a doctorate in moral theology with a dissertation, Earthly Destruction, Catholic Social Teaching, War, and the Environment. He's the co-author with Eric Martin of the Berrigan Letters, personal correspondence between Daniel and Philip Berrigan. And if you haven't read it, go to Orbis's website tonight before you go to bed and order it. It's a magnificent book. He's also finishing up a book that will be published shortly on the four Americans that Pope Francis singled out in his address to Congress in 2015, which is also a magnificent book. So keep your eye out for that. Dan is currently assistant professor of religious studies at Marywood University in Scranton, where he lives with his wife, Julia, and their adorable kindergarten daughter, Sam. The Jesuit martyr of El Salvador, Ignacio Ellacuría, is famous for saying, we do theology at a desk, but not from a desk. And Dan is a perfect example of a theologian who spends a lot of time at a desk and at a blackboard, but it's not theology from a desk. He's very much a theologian that is passionate about a faith that does justice, a theology that builds a world of peace, justice, and the flourishing of all life. So join me in welcoming my friend, Dan Cosacchi. You can all wave. Okay, Dan, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen first so I don't forget to do that. Just give me 1 second here. Can everybody see that slide on the screen? And can everybody hear me clearly? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Terry. And thanks to all of you for your warm welcome here this evening. It's a real honor to be with all of you at this event series. As I've already mentioned, my thanks to Terry, my greatest thanks go to him for inviting me here and for spearheading this series. I'm so grateful for this invitation. I hold the co-sponsoring organizations in such high regard that I consider it a really great honor, a high honor to be part of this series. My task today is to talk about Catholic social teaching and the environment, in particular, keeping in mind the Laudato Si Action Platform goal, response to the cry of the poor. Specifically, I will try to help us all answer this question. What call did I hear that will move us further along the path of ecological conversion? Just to give you a blueprint of my vision for this evening then. My goal is to map out a basic trajectory of Catholic social teaching on ecology while spending some substantial time on Pope Francis's groundbreaking 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, since it was this historic document that serves as the motivation for this action platform, and therefore this series of presentations in the first place. Throughout this, I will paint the picture of the natural environment as those poor who are crying out today, or as at least as among those poor. At the end, I will provide a more personal reflection from my own vantage point on our common question. The history of modern Catholic social teaching, dating back to 1891 and Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, is marked by a number of key concepts that date even further back in the magisterial documents issued by Leo's predecessors in the chair of St. Peter. Since the pontificate of John Paul II, the natural environment and all of God's creation has become a new concern in the corpus of Catholic social teaching. As any careful observer will be aware, however, the fact that it has been a new concern in the last 25 years is a point of contention for some Roman Catholics, and indeed all people who understand the challenges facing us on the planet today. There are basically three camps within the Catholic Church with opposing viewpoints on the renewed emphasis on care for creation in Catholic social teaching. The first of these camps could rightly be considered as beholden to the status quo. This group believes that the last three papacies, John Paul, Benedict, and Francis, have actually overstepped the limits of their teaching office and have misunderstood the relationship of individual believers to the entirety of creation. They might argue that God's creation may rightly and justly be utilized by all human beings for their own needs. They also tend to downplay the reports regarding the severity of ecological degradation or rising climate change concerns. The second group of Catholics tend to hold that the teachings of Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have been on a trajectory leading towards the right approach regarding the environment and non-human animals. That is to say, they would agree that there is what Pope Francis terms an integral ecology. Finally, the third group of Catholics would say that the Church has much more to learn from ecological scientists who have been warning for many decades that the global environmental crisis is reaching dire levels. Today, I will deal primarily with the beliefs of the latter two groups. It is irrefutable that the Roman Catholic Church has taken environmental issues seriously since at least 1990 and the promulgation of that year's World Day of Peace message by Pope John Paul II. It is also irrefutable that taking an issue seriously is not synonymous with giving it priority. Throughout the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, ecological concerns never gained the prominence of other issues, especially those of abortion and family planning. Since 1990, the environment has been taken up repeatedly in a variety of different statements by popes and regional bishops' conferences. As with John Paul II and Benedict XVI, however, most of these Episcopal conferences did not promote the ecological agenda in the same ways or with the same resources as they promoted other agendas. Moreover, a significant number of Catholic theologians have dealt with the topic in a direct manner. All of these points notwithstanding, in 1967, the environmentalist Lynn White Jr. penned one of the most damning arguments against Western Christianity's treatment of nature that has ever been written. White believed that the ecological crisis through which we are currently living, and which he detected even a half century ago, is rooted in Western Christianity and the dualism that has marred many centuries of its practice. As White explains, we shall continue to have a worsening ecologic crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. There's going to be a lot of gender exclusive language. I haven't changed it. I did that for a reason, just to keep in mind how these people and these popes were writing. Even though White was very clear about the upsetting ramifications of Western Christianity's dualistic legacy, he did see hope for the future of Christianity vis-a-vis the natural world, especially through the figure of one exemplary Christian whose feast day we celebrate today. And I've got the slide here, if I can bring it up. Just give me 1 second. There we go. The greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history, St. Francis, proposed what he thought was an alternative Christian view of nature and man's relation to it. He tried to substitute the idea of the equality of all creatures, including man, for the idea of man's limitless rule of creation. He failed. Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodoxy, with orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature, that no solution for our ecologic crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. We must rethink and refuel our nature and destiny. The profoundly religious but heretical sense of the primitive Franciscans for the spiritual autonomy of all parts of nature may point a direction. I propose Francis as a patron saint for ecologists. end quote. Whether it was in direct response to White's critique or not, in his apostolic letter Inter Sanctos of 1979, Pope John Paul II declared St. Francis as patron saint of those who promote ecology. That was a dozen years after White's essay was written. And now, happily, a pope who is so close to Francis that he adopted his name has taken seriously the call to revere all of creation, just as his saintly namesake did. When rumors began to surface that Pope Francis was preparing a social encyclical to focus primarily on the natural environment, the Pope's popularity and the urgent importance of the issue combined to make Laudato Si the most eagerly anticipated papal encyclical since Pope Paul VI's Humanae Vitae of 1968, which upheld the Church's prohibition of artificial contraception. Indeed, a significant number of people, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, have read at least some of Laudato Si. This is no small feat, especially considering the length of the document. By any measurement, Laudato Si is the longest Catholic social encyclical that has ever been published. Furthermore, the encyclical genre does not lend itself to a wide reading by the public. Many people consider it to be a sure cure for insomnia, as a matter of fact. Even when encyclicals have been addressed to audiences wider than clergy over the past decades, they have often only been read by theologians interested in the topic, and a sampling of priests and bishops. I should also mention that even though this message has gained some popular and secular attention, there remains ample room for improvement as far as the number of Catholics who should familiarize themselves with this text goes. Nevertheless, this is a good development because Pope Francis addressed the letter to every person living on the planet. Part of the reason for such a broad audience is that Francis wanted to ensure the encyclical would impact the deliberations at the December 2015 UN Climate Change Conference. Moreover, it is a positive response to an important political message. In this text, Francis builds on some key foundational beliefs about the natural environment that have been expressed in previous magisterial documents. It is worthwhile to examine his argument in light of the principle of solidarity. Solidarity is one of the most important characteristics of Catholic social teaching. As Pope John Paul II put it, solidarity is the virtue that allows us to serve all of God's human creation. Quote, thus the process of development and liberation takes concrete shape in the exercise of solidarity. That is to say, in the love and service of neighbor, especially of the poorest, end quote. Pope Benedict expanded this thinking of solidarity in his 2009 social encyclical, Caritas in Veritate. Every violation of solidarity and civic friendship harms the environment, just as environmental deterioration in turn upsets relations in society. Nature in our time is so integrated into the dynamics of society and culture that by now it hardly constitutes an independent variable. Even with the explication of solidarity given here by Benedict, there was still a divergence between the papal teaching on the topic of the natural environment and that offered by environmental scientists. There was substantial room for development of doctrine on this issue by Pope Francis. In Laudato Si, then, Pope Francis makes it clear that the historical definition of solidarity is no longer sufficient for understanding the relationship of human beings to non-human creation. He introduces a more nuanced reading of solidarity in his encyclical. I submit that we should understand him to endorse a radical ecological solidarity. Now, Francis never uses this precise term. This is my term here. I do not wish to confuse the fact that Francis maintains that solidarity is still primarily a human virtue. By introducing the term ecological solidarity, though, I do wish to make the term broader than its original meaning. Here, Francis indicates some new understanding of the term. In paragraph 14, he cites the South African bishops by calling for a universal solidarity. And in paragraphs 159 and 162, he calls for an intergenerational solidarity that keeps in mind the needs of the future generations. Finally, in paragraph 240, Francis notes that a global solidarity comes directly from the Holy Trinity. Historically, the virtue of solidarity has been understood through a particularly human lens. Not only was it considered to be an action befitting virtuous human beings only, but it was also directed towards other human beings. In Laudato Si, Francis makes a careful movement forward in the discussion of solidarity. In line with Benedict, Francis understands that solidarity in the 21st century very much has to do with non-humans. Unlike Benedict, however, Francis makes it clear that we have been hampered in the past by what he calls tyrannical anthropocentrism. Now, this is a brand new term that Francis introduces into the body of Catholic social teaching. To turn away from tyrannical anthropocentrism means to turn towards a more holistic understanding of the relationship between human beings and non-human creation. Here, it is clear that Pope Francis wishes to return to some of the sources of patristic and medieval church mothers and fathers who reverenced all of creation. While the tradition hasn't always strayed from an anthropocentric bias, there is material from which we can draw in order to avoid falling even deeper into this troubling condition today. Pope Francis believes that the Gospels propel Christians to work for the good of all creation. Here he is drawing on some fundamental concerns first introduced by his two immediate predecessors. While there had been brief mentions of environmental issues as early as Gaudium et Spes in 1965, Pope John Paul II was the first pontiff to bring particular attention to the matter in his own magisterium. In his 1987 encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis, John Paul makes clear that the issue is one that affects us all. He points out that the natural resources are limited. While this claim seems clear now, it was a novel thing to read in an encyclical almost 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago, I should say. I hasten to add once again, however, that secular ecological scientist Lynn White, mentioned above, were still at it much, much earlier than the popes. Of natural resources, John Paul continues, using them as if they were inexhaustible with absolute dominion seriously endangers their availability not only for the present generation, but above all, for generations to come. 3 years later, John Paul II dedicated a World Day of Peace message to the natural environment for the very first time. In this message, his thought matured even more to the point of making a clear connection between human actions and the already serious environmental crisis that the Earth was experiencing. The key line from the document reads, "The gradual depletion of the ozone layer and the related greenhouse effect has now reached crisis proportions as a consequence of industrial growth, massive urban concentrations, and vastly increased energy needs. Industrial waste, the burning of fossil fuels, unrestricted deforestation, the use of certain types of herbicides, coolants, and propellants, all of these are known to harm the atmosphere and environment," end quote. To mark a century of modern Catholic social teaching, in his final social encyclical, Centesimus Annus, John Paul II continued his thread, calling for greater care for creation at the expense of personal comfort and human destruction of nature for selfish reasons. Quote, "In his desire to have and to enjoy, rather than to be and to grow, man consumes the resources of the earth and his own life in an excessive and disordered way," end quote. So we can see that there have been explicit charges of human connection with the earth's destruction for the last 35 years of magisterial Catholic social teaching. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI borrowed this concept from his predecessor by introducing the term intergenerational solidarity. By employing this particular term, Benedict was building on the preceding argument of John Paul II in noting that with creation in present peril, human beings had the responsibility to act so that future generations of humans might experience the same gifts of the natural world that current and previous generations had enjoyed. This commonality between the environmental thought of John Paul and Benedict could be traced to a fundamental belief that these two popes shared. There is a clear connection between the way that human beings treat the earth and the way they treat themselves. First introduced by John Paul, this belief is explained most eloquently in Benedict's 2009 Caritas in Veritate. This encyclical letter was significant for a number of reasons. Not only was it Benedict's only social encyclical, but it also shone a new spotlight on the issue of the environment within Catholic social teaching. Until the writing of this letter, a total of only 5 paragraphs in all prior social encyclicals had dealt directly with the natural environment. In Caritas in Veritate alone, Benedict devoted the same number of paragraphs to this pressing issue. This led to a number of commentators bestowing the moniker of Green Pope on Benedict to match the title Green Patriarch, which had already been used to describe ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, the leader of the Greek Orthodox community. In Caritas in Veritate, Benedict notes, the way humanity treats the environment influences the way it treats itself, and vice versa. For Benedict, this is a way of saying that the environment brings to the fore the question of solidarity, as I noted earlier. The question remains, however, has Francis brought anything new to the table with the promulgation of Laudato Si? Or is his encyclical simply rehashing everything that his two predecessors had already introduced?
Oops, I'm sorry.
In the remainder of my time today, I will highlight some areas in which Pope Francis has made strides beyond John Paul and Benedict, then conclude with ways in which the encyclical could have been improved even further. The first area in which Francis has brought about a major evolution of the tradition is by introducing the term integral ecology. In past magisterial dealings with the natural environment, there have been clear distinctions between human ecology on one hand and environmental ecology on the other. What is ironic about the way these two types of ecology had been discussed in previous papal statements on the environment is that they were meant by the popes in question to show the relationships between human beings and the natural world. As I noted earlier, these two terms were mainly used to show the reader that the way humans treat the rest of creation would be emblematic of the way they treated each other. The irony, however, rests in the fact that the result of utilizing these two separate terms is that they were too easily seen as two distinct issues. Pope Francis has sought to avoid such a problem by introducing his fresh terminology. Now, what does it mean to promote an integral ecology? At the outset, it seems obvious that Pope Francis believes that such an ideological worldview is impossible without first understanding the present situation on this planet. By coming to a better understanding of the reality currently facing our society, it should become obvious that human beings have failed in our vocation as stewards of creation. Following in the footsteps of his predecessors, Francis makes it clear that human beings have become seduced by the attraction of worldly goods, especially technology. Francis is neither troglodyte nor Luddite. He acknowledges that nuclear energy, biotechnology, information technology, knowledge of our DNA, and so many other abilities which we have acquired have given us tremendous power. However, this power is abused, Francis argues, when humans use our outstanding knowledge and gifted minds for purposes that contradict the moral order. He continues, we need but think of the nuclear bombs dropped in the middle of the 20th century, or the array of technology which Nazism, communism, and other totalitarian regimes have employed to kill millions of people, to say nothing of the increasingly deadly arsenal of weapons available for modern warfare. In whose hands does all this power lie, or will it eventually end up? It is extremely risky for a small part of humanity to have it. Francis believes that we should take pains to measure the situation and understand that having such power at our disposal is not a good thing in an unqualified sense. How does Francis suggest that we move forward in a way that maturely appropriates the technology at our disposal? In one of the most forthright passages of the encyclical, Francis proclaims there to be an urgent need for us to move forward in a bold cultural revolution. This revolution is one that must be rooted in the gospel, but does not necessitate a return to the Stone Age. The paradox at the heart of Francis's revolutionary message is precisely what the Council Fathers called for during the final days of the Second Vatican Council: the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. To scrutinize the signs of the times today in the 21st century and interpret them in the light of the gospel means to broaden our perspective to include new areas within the purview of Christianity. Pope Francis's declaration that an integral ecology is necessary to carry out the gospel today also means that a careful scrutiny of the signs of the times makes it evident that human beings are at fault for much of the environmental degradation that we see around us. Even though John Paul II and Benedict XVI wrote about the natural environment, Francis' pontificate has opened up a new priority in Catholic social thought. While the natural environment was an interest of his two immediate predecessors, even a cursory review of their pontificates proves that it was not a priority. For Francis, however, the degradation of the environment stands at the very heart of his papal ministry. Pope Francis makes it clear that one of the greatest challenges to an integral ecology in today's society is excessive anthropocentrism, or the aforementioned tyrannical anthropocentrism. He continues by noting that such an outlook has brought human beings to a point in their existence where they believe themselves to be God's ultimate gift to creation, to the exclusion of other creatures. Of this outlook, Francis concludes, what was handed on was a Promethean vision of mastery over the world, which gave the impression that the protection of nature was something only the faint-hearted cared about. Instead, our dominion over the universe should be understood more properly in the sense of responsible stewardship. This teaching is not new within Catholic thought, but it is an original papal insight in Laudato Si. Here, Francis certainly remains faithful to the thought of his predecessors, but he also builds on their writing to introduce new magisterial terminology for Christian anthropology, an anthropology that, for the first time in the magisterial teachings of the Church, is deeply informed by the findings of the ecological sciences. We have seen Francis's explanation of what stands in the way of integral ecology. The question remains, however, what adequately fulfills our calling to bring about integral ecology? First, a careful understanding of the word integral is in order. Here, Francis is using the word to remind us that it means the whole. It is no surprise, then, that the most often repeated turn of phrase he uses in the encyclical is everything is interconnected, or everything is related, or everything is interrelated, or everything is connected. In other words, everything makes up the integral whole. The human ecology and the environmental ecology come together in integral ecology. This comes out most clearly when Francis declares that human ecology shows forth the relationship between human life and the moral law, which is inscribed in our nature and is necessary for the creation of a more dignified environment. Put another way, human ecology is a pathway to integral ecology. Francis continues, it is enough to recognize that our body itself establishes us in a direct relationship with the environment and with other living beings, end quote. By itself, human ecology has been an explicitly named part of Catholic social teaching for only a quarter century. Implicitly, however, it has been crucial to Catholic thought for centuries. Pope Francis makes the key move toward integral ecology with a startling turn of phrase that underlines the concept of universal interconnectedness. He writes, we are a part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it, end quote. While his papal predecessors have always acknowledged that we are a part of nature, the concept of integral ecology is a first step toward moving beyond the great chain of being. The second evolution, I'll say more about that in a moment. The second evolution of the tradition brought forth by Francis is a new envisioning of this hierarchical chain, a revision that proposes to lead Catholic social teaching toward an understanding of a great circle of being. Now, there are two ways to understand the great chain of being. The first such way is to view it as a hierarchical view of the cosmos. In this hierarchy, since human beings are far above the remainder of creation, we naturally dictate what becomes of other non-rational creatures. While Thomas Aquinas is not responsible for introducing it to the Christian worldview, he does get the most credit. As Anglican theologian Paul Santmere explains, reading Thomas leaves us only with ambiguity in describing the theology of nature. But why should the tradition's treatment of nature be ambiguous at all? On one hand, Thomas says very clearly of God, because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided. And hence the whole universe together participates in the divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatever. As we know, however, this is not the entire story. The reality is that Thomas still held closely to a worldview that had a penchant for a particular type of ranking of things. Along these lines, Thomas held to the inequality of all created things, but for a very important reason. Hence, in natural things, species seem to be arranged in degrees. As the mixed things are more perfect than the elements, and plants than minerals, and animals than plants, and men than other animals, and in each of these one species is more perfect than the others. Therefore, as the divine wisdom is the cause of the distinction of things for the sake of the perfection of the universe, so is it the cause of inequality. For the universe would not be perfect if only one grade of goodness were found in things, end quote. The heart of what has been known as the great chain of being is on display in this explanation. Therein lies the ambiguity to which Saint-Mir points in his work. With human beings near the very top of the great chain of being, only below the angels, there has been a hurdle within the Catholic intellectual tradition to provide solid framework for the inherent goodness and dignity of all divine creation. What is the second way, then, to understand this great chain of being? In fact, it is more appropriate to follow the work of the late Father Norris Clark, who considered the great diversity of creation, which leads to the perfection of the universe, as the great circle of being. Clark's proposal meets the inherent problem of the great chain of being head on. One potential problem with the chain approach is not so much that it naturally eliminates animal and plant life, but rather the fact that over time, theological and ethical attention began to take the order of creation for granted and concentrated concern and attention on the distinct value of the human alone. In the medieval worldview, the human person was set within a broader community of creation. The problem in question is what Pope Francis terms excessive anthropocentrism. The great circle of being tries to correct this problem. This approach makes it clear that human beings are only one part of God's creation. True, the great chain of being, as originally projected, does the same thing. As we know, the resulting understandings over many centuries of this concept have led to something quite different, however. The result has been a society where human beings utilize all other created beings for our own purposes. The image of a circle works much better than a chain here. The chain breaks irreparably when such an arrangement is in effect. The only movement away from self-destruction is by establishing a new standard for humans' treatment of non-human creation. Clark's own thought here has one major shortcoming. He notes, quote, "The rest of the vast material universe below the human is incapable by its very nature of attaining union with God, of contemplating its journey back to the one, its source by itself. It needs a mediator that can take it up into itself and somehow carry it back home with itself. This is precisely what we humans can do, and we alone." First, the phrase below the human is hardly comprehensible within the image of a circle. That is more akin to the chain language, which Clark otherwise consciously avoids. Second, though, it does appear that Clark is onto an important insight in the remainder of the thought. It would turn on its head many centuries of poor relationships between human beings and the animal world to see humans actually act as mediators for other creation. Mediation is, of course, far superior to destruction. But I must pose the question here, why can't animals be mediators for human beings? Shouldn't the intellectual superiority that humans enjoy give us the insight to allow ourselves to be mediated by plants and animals too? The only way that the great circle of being can work adequately is if all of creation is willing to work together. This requires one species, we humans, to humble ourselves. And this all brings us back to Pope Francis, Laudato Si, and the Catholic social tradition. I submit that Francis, building off the work of his predecessors, makes it possible to employ the great circle of being in the official magisterium of Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis rightly calls the entire world to a conversion of heart that will lead to a new relationship between the human family and the community of non-human creation. He calls human beings to cease being so caught up in selfish behaviors. Quote, "We are always capable of going out of ourselves toward the other. Unless we do this, other creatures will not be recognized in their true worth. We are unconcerned about caring for things for the sake of others. We fail to set limits on ourselves in order to avoid the suffering of others or the deterioration of our surroundings," end quote. There are three key things to take from this call to action. First, Francis is calling us to assign true worth as an other to non-human creatures. If we are able to see them as an other toward which we can move in order to carry out a relationship, that is a first step toward actually doing it. Second, we need to drop the selfish behavior that has plagued the poor of the world. The natural environment is just like the poor in the human family. More on that in a second. They have both been neglected for far too long. Third, we must be characterized not by our boundless power and strength, but rather by our boundless compassion and care. Let me return briefly to the second point that Francis makes about the call to action, because that directly recalls the way the poor are treated on our planet. Listen to how Francis draws out the connection between the poor and the earth itself. Long quote here. It needs to be said that, generally speaking, there is little in the way of clear awareness of problems which especially affect the excluded. Yet they are the majority of the planet's population, billions of people. These days, they are mentioned in international political and economic discussions, but one often has the impression that their problems are brought up as an afterthought, a question which gets added almost out of duty or in a tangential way, if not treated merely as collateral damage. Indeed, when all is said and done, they frequently remain at the bottom of the pile. This is due partly to the fact that many professionals, opinion makers, communications media, and centers of power, being located in affluent urban areas, are far removed from the poor, with little direct contact with their problems. They live and reason from the comfortable position of a high level of development and a quality of life well beyond the reach of the majority of the world's population. This lack of physical contact and encounter, encouraged at times by the disintegration of our cities, can lead to a numbing of conscience and to tendentious analyses which neglect parts of reality. At times, this attitude exists side by side with a green rhetoric. Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, end quote. In fact, as I am trying to make clear, both of these cries, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, are actually sounding as one larger cry for justice and mercy. This is the case because all of the environmental catastrophes that take place on our planet wreak the greatest havoc on the poor. Most importantly, though, we must not forget the double curse global overconsumption is for the poor. In the first place, it is a curse because it is only the wealthy people who are utilizing all of the world's resources. And as we know, we are utilizing more than could ever be sustainable. So the poor are suffering in the first place because while the wealthy are using far more than they need, the poor are left with far less than they need, or practically speaking, nothing. Or as Francis cites the New Zealand bishops, quote, 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive, end quote. The second part of this curse, however, is also noteworthy, regrettable, and sinful. Francis reminds us, quote, the warming caused by huge consumption on the part of some rich countries has repercussions on the poorest areas of the world. To listen to the cry of the poor is to listen to the cry of the earth. But imagine it in the terms of a crying child, perhaps your own, or your grandchild, or your niece or nephew, or someone in your midst. Their tears often mean you, I, need to change our ways. Likewise, Francis wants us to undergo an ecological conversion. In carrying out this change or ecological conversion, Pope Francis is calling each person to realize that God has created more than only our individual selves. Moreover, Francis seeks in his reader, quote, the awareness that each creature reflects something of God and has a message to convey to us, and the security that Christ has taken unto himself this material world, and now, risen, is intimately present to each being, surrounding it with his affection and penetrating it with his light. Then too, there is the recognition that God created the world, writing into it an order and a dynamism that human beings have no right to ignore, end quote. If each human person understands that every creature, human and non-human alike, has inherent dignity because of its creator, Pope Francis is arguing that there should be a natural change in human lifestyle. Only then will there be any possibility for a great circle of being. Or, as Elizabeth Johnson explains, ecological conversion means falling in love with the earth as an inherently valuable, living community in which we participate, and bending every effort to be creatively faithful to its well-being, in tune with the living God who brought it into being and cherishes it with unconditional love. This turning is not done to the exclusion of other human beings, especially those poor and marginalized, but in view of their flourishing, which is intertwined with ecological health on all levels. End quote. While I am confident that the magisterium of Pope Francis places us closer to an official magisterial acceptance of this great circle of being than ever before, I am also cognizant that we are still far short of this ideal ethical model. There are still times in Laudato Si when Francis drifts back into language that is still more consistent with hierarchical ways of addressing non-human creation than with more circular language. Ironically, this is nowhere more evident than in the encyclical section dealing with the human cause of the environmental crisis. Francis maintains, quote, Christian thought sees human beings as possessing a particular dignity above other creatures. It thus inculcates esteem for each person and respect for others. Our openness to others, each of whom is a thou capable of knowing, loving, and entering into dialogue, remains the source of our nobility as human persons, end quote. Francis addresses this very issue even more directly earlier in the text, while pointing to the universal communion that should be at work among all God's creation. Quote, this is not to put all living beings on the same level, nor to deprive human beings of their unique worth and the tremendous responsibility it entails. Nor does it imply a divinization of the earth, which would prevent us from working on it and protecting it in its fragility. Such notions would end up creating new imbalances, which would deflect us from the reality which challenges us. At times, we see an obsession with denying any preeminence to the human person. More zeal is shown in protecting other species than in defending the dignity which all human beings share in an equal measure. Certainly, we should be concerned lest other living beings be treated irresponsibly, but we should be particularly indignant at the enormous inequalities in our midst, whereby we continue to tolerate some considering themselves more worthy than others, end quote. There is no mistaking Pope Francis for someone who believes that non-human species should be considered more important than human beings. I do not wish to propose that argument either. I do, however, believe that Laudato Si could have made an even stronger rhetorical argument than it does in its current state if it had omitted any discussion of human beings having a particular preeminence over other creatures or a particular dignity above other creatures. The document could have made an even stronger argument for a great circle of being than it already does if it had not used terms implying a vertical rather than a horizontal order to creation. Nevertheless, there is clear development in the statement that the natural world has intrinsic value. What does all of this say about Laudato Si? It says that the document represents a strong movement forward in the Catholic social tradition's understanding of the natural environment and the role of our own human species in it. This point notwithstanding, it is also clear that Catholic social teaching is an evolving tradition. For many centuries, there has been an emphasis on the great chain of being, which has not been without its merits. Now, though, Pope Francis is ushering Catholic social thought into a new epoch in its history. No longer is it so caught up in ordering every level of creation on a hierarchical chain, but it is finally opening the possibility for a great circle of being. Even this movement, as I have shown, is not a seamless shift. Even Francis wishes to maintain some level of uniqueness for human beings. The dynamic nature of the Catholic social tradition, though, shows us that its ecological thought is never static. Catholic ethicists must continue monitoring the tradition and searching for ways to expand it if we are to push it beyond what limits are currently in place. And now, if you would permit me a few moments for a personal reflection on the precise question that we are all meant to be considering this evening and throughout this entire series, namely, what call did I hear that will move us further along the path of ecological conversion? This terminology of ecological conversion was first used on the magisterial level by Pope John Paul II during his Wednesday audience on January 27th, 2001. He stated, quote, "We must therefore encourage and support the ecological conversion, which in recent decades has made humanity more sensitive to the catastrophe to which it has been heading. Man is no longer the creator's steward, but an autonomous despot who is finally beginning to understand that he must stop at the edge of the abyss." For Francis's part, he gets very practical. This conversion requires a particular change in our lifestyle. We can no longer live as though things were just fine around us. First of all, such conversion is individual. Quoting the Australian Bishops' Conference, Francis explains, quote, "We must examine our lives and acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed God's creation through our actions and our failures to act. We need to experience a conversion or change of heart." What does that look like for me? As I wrote these words, I looked around my office and noticed how many times I have elected to print off something on paper that I could have left as an electronic PDF. I recognize too that I live in a place where I am surrounded by beauty, especially in the gorgeous mountain ranges around me. Nevertheless, I must confess that I have spent precious little time cherishing those surroundings. And I am ashamed to admit that I sometimes do not consume all of the food that is in my refrigerator. And then it goes bad. Of course, this affects the poor most of all. Or as Pope Francis puts it, whenever food is thrown out, it is as if it were stolen from the table of the poor. Those three areas which relate to my consumption of the earth's goods are concrete ways in which my life is not yet measuring up to what Francis is calling for from all of us. Now, if you would permit me to offer a perspective on behalf of my general community, those who work and study at colleges and universities. Pope Francis is clear that ecological conversion on the communal level calls for a number of attitudes which together foster a spirit of generous care, full of tenderness. First, it entails gratitude and gratuitousness, a recognition that the world is God's loving gift, and that we are called quietly to imitate his generosity in self-sacrifice and good works. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. It also entails a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. As believers, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all beings. By developing our individual God-given capacities, an ecological conversion can inspire us to greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems and in offering ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. We do not understand our superiority as a reason for personal glory or irresponsible dominion, but rather as a different capacity, which in its turn entails a serious responsibility stemming from our faith, end quote. As I have already indicated, I disagree with this last part insofar as Francis identifies the superiority of human beings to the rest of the created order. But that point notwithstanding, he is exactly right that we humans share a serious and even unique responsibility to convert our communal life together. At our colleges and universities, we should be constantly grateful for our planet. And yet, I do not need even all the fingers of one hand to count the times I have had the opportunity to attend a liturgy of gratitude or prayer for our planet in the last 17 years at Catholic colleges and universities. As for the loving awareness that we are joined in a splendid universal communion, I think that many Catholic institutions of higher learning do a fine job with service initiatives on their campuses. And yet, what we could be doing better is moving our students away from the language of help and closer to the language of kinship, like Father Gregory Boyle of Homeboy Industries has done such a good job of embodying. This would be a real conversion in the lives of our students, faculty, and staff and administrations. In the time that we have left for discussion now, I certainly look forward to hearing ways in which you and your communities feel called to respond to this action plan. On this blessed feast day, perhaps you would permit me to end with an old legend that today's saint, Francis of Assisi, was purported to have said to God through tears. And so it, in fact, itself was a cry of the poor. Francis said, "I love the sun and the stars. I love Claire and her sisters. I love the human hearts and all beautiful things. Lord, forgive me, for I should love only you." The Lord smiled and replied, "I love the sun and the stars. I love Claire and her sisters. I love the human hearts and all beautiful things. My dear Francis, you need not weep, for I also love all this." Thank you so much and happy feast.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that incredibly comprehensive and insightful and challenging presentation. So I invite everybody now just to take a minute of quiet and let bump around in your heart the things that Dan has shared for us. And then try to hear what your own answer is to that question. What of the many wonderful things we heard in the past 45 minutes, what is pointing out to me, to you, the next step we need to take in ecological conversion? So I can't see all the many people on the screen at once. So if you'd like to share, unmute yourself, and hopefully we won't be talking over each other too much. So what have you heard this evening that propels you a step further on the path of ecological conversion?
I think for me, this is Donna. First of all, Dan, thank you so much for your presentation. It struck so many things in my heart, but I think that idea of conversion of heart and living with intentionality, as you were speaking, those very many beautiful quotes, I was thinking of a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I'll paraphrase it, but the last part of it is something like, let us walk as if your feet are kissing the earth. Walk as if your feet are kissing the earth. I guess your presentation just called me to that realization of a conversion of heart is needed and living with intentionality. And what if we could really walk as if our feet were kissing the earth with every step? How different the world would be. But I guess that living with intentionality is what came to my heart. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
I appreciate, Donna, what you just said, and I appreciate Dan too, for your sharing tonight. The conversion of heart is critical, and you gave some very simple examples that it really made me stop for a moment, especially about like, do I need to print that, or the food waste. So frequently I try not to waste things, and I feel badly when I do. And so these kind of actions are fairly simple, but I think they'll help me, and I'm sure I'll think of others, to just help raise my consciousness so that so that this well, crises, this importance of being focused on our environment and caring for it. And that's everyone and every living creature on the planet. Just these simple things that I can do. So I appreciate these ideas today. And as Donna mentioned, this conversion of heart that is so critical to keep living in our own lives, but also being, open and sharing our story, our journey. And I know for me over the years, that's what's helped me with many times of being converted, of hearing other stories and their journey. So thank you.
I like to follow up on that. I think the three examples that you gave, Dan, as Susanna just said, really struck me. I think the first, well, two of them I do try to do, watch the paper printing and all of that, and try to be very careful about food. Look at those leftovers in the refrigerator and how can I put them together and be creative and do something with them. I think I'm just sitting here thinking there's something in the word intentionality, doing it with intention, that I need to pay attention to. I'm not sure, there's something there that's asking for my attention. To do those things, yes, but not in a matter of fact kind of way or something. I don't know what it is. If you have a way to highlight intentionality, or anyone else does, I would appreciate it.
I think we often think we have to do heroic things, or we look for heroic things that we can do. And I just want to point out, I'll give Terry a commercial. Today I got on, I don't remember where I got this, but it was 6 weeks with Laudato Si. And I just loved it because each day there is something that is really within your realm of doing. And it's wonderful. So he may be able to tell you where you can get it. But because I always look for the big heroic things and then I don't get to do them. So thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Pat. Pat was my high school geometry teacher, so that's
Oh, God
high
help
praise.
Oh, I
Um,
kept,
Yeah, that 6 week with the Laudato Si in the chat, I put my email. So if anyone would like a copy of it, I'd be happy to send it to you. And I'm reminded in Laudato Si, Pope Francis talks about a saint whose feast we celebrated on the 1st, Therese of Lisieux, and how he talks about the importance and the nobility of small gestures done faithfully, done consistently. And sometimes it's easier to get the energy to do one heroic gesture occasionally. But in the daily, day-to-day grind, to keep faithful and intentional, as a number of people have said, to this different way of relationship, day after day, week after week, year after year, that is heroic too.
I don't know if I'm on. I liked when he was speaking about ecological conversion. I think many of us have loved the earth. We choose to go to retreats to the most beautiful settings or to the beach. But when Dan was talking more about awareness, I think that some of us, me, have probably taken all this beauty for granted, but now knowing, even as you are presenting us with those different pointers to think about regarding Laudato Si, I know I have a lot to learn, not just to be someone who is taking in the beauty of Earth, but also being responsible, not only to be careful in my own area, but as an educator, to also bring the message to other people. And even that is connected with poverty. You know, I have books. The poor don't always have books or the opportunity to hear some of these great messages, if that makes sense what I'm saying.
There's been a question, of what sacrifices might we make? In thinking of it, I just thought of the title, Laudato Si. The sacrifice of praise is a good beginning for conversion. And I think just having been in Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia recently, there's an element of just being in the great beauty that when you see where it has been violated, there's a feeling of compunction that kind of right away you really do start thinking a more constructive way of how to heal it. But at the same time, you also see where in some places it's begun to heal. A kind of a black coal hill that is now covered with grass, or a strip mined area that has now become an apple orchard. Yes, but I think that kind of cycle of compunction, compassion, conversion and compassion. I think that's kind of, it's not just a one-time thing, but it keeps going. But we need to go to the beautiful places, but we need to also go to the wounded places, whether it's in the city or wherever. But even there, you see at different times where a community garden is started. I think those are, I think that's an important piece for me. But I also have to remember to turn the power strip off at night too.
I think I'm very conscious of what I spend money on, what products I purchase with that money. And specifically, some of you have heard this, plastic bottles, water, even toilet paper that comes wrapped in plastic. And there are many, many sites on the internet where you can go and find products wrapped in paper, old-fashioned paper and cardboard that can come right to your home. So I think in our home, we can look around and look at the plastic that we take into our home and do a little research and see if there's products, and there are, that can come to us not wrapped in plastic, and we can save our oceans, and we even ingest that plastic in our clothes, and when we wash our clothes it goes out into the water again. So I think that's a huge, in a sense, little thing that we can look at.
Mary, do unmute yourself.
Well, I was thinking about how you were talking about the hierarchical structure, the vertical structure, and how, and then you told us about the circle, and all I could picture was animals on a merry-go-round and people. You know how they have the animals, the horses and lions, and then people are there riding it. And I just kept thinking in my mind about, we're going around together in this whole global earth or whatever, and a sense of gratitude for the animals, and how much, like in this pandemic, how much animals brought joy to many people. It could be birds that came to a feeder. It could be dogs that were gotten, from shelters, and how happy. And people didn't treat their animals during this time. I would notice them. They really treat them as members of their families, equals. And it was really a beautiful thing. So I think I got the fact that this hierarchy thing is just never going to work. We really have to look at that we're all in this together, animals, nature, if we're going to save this planet. So that's just what I thought.
I was also struck by that image of, the chain of being as opposed to the community in a circle, and how much those of us in the developed, comfortable world, even though we say we're in favor of the circle and community, in actuality, we assume that what life is normal for us, we have a right to, and that other people who don't have that, well, that's just the way the world is. And how much priority we put my comfort, my schedule, my time, my interests, trump everything else, other people in other parts of the world, and certainly animals. That I'll make occasional concessions to them, but the way the world basically should run is so that the way I want things to go, that's the way they should go. And that's a tremendous conversion we're all called to. And, making, as people have said, making those connections between what I do every day. How is that manifesting my idea that really my plans and my interests and my comfort are the number one value? And that really requires a conversion, as deep a conversion as anything that Jesus talked about.
This is Joyce, and I was thinking that when we had the immigrants fast for immigration, and I remember that was a long period of time, I used to think about an immigrant in the desert and they needing water and so forth. And it was easier for me to keep the fast because I thought of the persons that it affected. Now, maybe that is exactly the same way now. We need some images. I need to look at a CRS calendar or something every day and realize that when I run the water extra, someone else is not having even a small bit of water, or how do I reuse the water that I can use it maybe 2 or 3 times? And I guess if we connect it with real situations, and I realize that's, again, relating it to a human, but that's hearing the cry of the poor. I saw someone today saying the birds don't have any water. It was in a medical facility. And they said the birds don't have any water. So they were trying to fetch it. The people that usually water them, they were not on duty today, but looking for the water for the birds. So I guess making those connections, and I think that's that business of intentionality, that others are important. It's not just my way. Thank you very much, Dan, for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah, Dan, I wanted to thank you as well. Early on, you spoke about the problem many of us have of not being able to relate to the poor, not being close to them, not seeing the way they live, maybe hearing about it, but not seeing it. And, I've encountered that myself since I was a youth minister at age 20 something. But, the realities of it, you made a point toward the end about looking less at this as a way of helping than as a way of developing kinship. And, just in my own life, I've had the opportunity recently to move into a house of hospitality for asylum seekers. And we're not living in poverty. The food's paid for by the congregation and the house is provided. But it's been such a privilege to be here and to see how we have 4 asylum seekers. One is from Congo, Tibet, Afghanistan, and Haiti. So, to see the 4 of them loving each other day in and day out, helping to teach somebody to cook. Somebody's going on a job interview and they automatically set up practice interviews at the table when we're meeting for a meal. Taking somebody out for a full day, just filling out applications to get, some kind of temporary job. It really is a privilege, and it's really, they've been helping me heal my own woundedness, so it's not a matter of coming here to help. Frankly, it didn't fit into my schedule to come here when I did, but it's just beautiful to see these people from scattered corners of the earth living and loving each other in the way that they do.
Dan, you gave us so much in a short period of time that I can't even respond. And yet, the thing that struck me perhaps most is that the key for me is the solidarity. That every single little action I take during the day has a ripple effect way out there that I have no idea of. So it calls me to be much more intentional about the actions of my day. Sorry, it's asthma. And so the whole notion of solidarity, I think, is what calls me and us to a real conversion that's going to take a long time. And we can't orchestrate that. We have to be open to it as it comes to us.
Maybe one more. Going once, going twice.
Could I say something?
Who? Yes. Whoever you are, yes.
Dan, I'm sorry I arrived late, but what you said at the end, including the prayer of a prayer from St. Francis, a conversation with God, it just made me think about how necessary it is, in a sense, to pay attention to what's happening in the world, because in a sense, detachment is a form of privilege. And we have to use the privileges that we have to mitigate our climate disasters as much as possible and protect the vulnerable. So thank you for sharing that as well.
Okay, so I think we all echo the sentiment that Gail expressed, that Dan gave us so much in a short period of time, that it's certainly we'll be thinking about it for a long time. And Dan, you wouldn't mind sharing your slides, would you? Okay, so in the, as I said, my email is in the chat box. So if you're interested in getting the link to the recording of Dan's presentation and his slides, or 6 weeks with Laudato Si, you can email me and I'll make sure you get that and anything else you want as soon as it's available. Just a reminder that our next presentation in the series is Monday, November 1st, 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be on ecological economics. And the presenter is Jillian Lyon, who is the program lead for Climate and the Climate and Dignity Initiative of Investor Advocates for Social Justice. Jillian's a young woman and marvelously well-informed. So it will be yet another excellent presentation in the series. So thank you all for coming, and thank you most of all for Dan, who again is incredibly comprehensive and provocative, and also you get a sense that he's a person who's on the same journey, who's struggling with ecological conversion in his own life. And I have to tell you, I got a chat message from his wife, Julia, who said that every time Dan mentioned Francis, his kindergarten-age daughter said, "Pope or saint?"
Oh, how cute.
So, she's adorable, and obviously has the makings of a theologian herself. So, Dan, thank you so much for everything you've said, and even more for who you are. So
Thank you all. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
So hopefully we'll see
Thank
you all
you.
next month, and we'll give Dan a virtual applause, or however we do it, shake your hands. And so everybody have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you hopefully on November 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you,
November
Terry.
1st.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
see you next time. Bye-bye now.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.